everyone, it's Miss Rossi. Today we're going to be going over some different techniques we can use with our materials. Now you will have the choice to use these materials on your project, so you can pick using any of the materials I have today, using any of the different techniques I'm going to show you. Of course, you can always use whatever materials you have at home, or if you think something is going to work better for what you have created, you always have the option to use that instead. These are just examples and different ways that you can use some of our supplies to finish off your project today. So some of the things that I have here to start out with, I have my paper. Now this is a piece of watercolor paper. It's like the one that I gave you in your art folder. So it is thicker. It has a little bit of a texture on it. If you feel it, it feels almost like bumpy. There's some little ridges on it. And it is going to be a lot sturdier and act a little bit differently than regular paper would for our materials. So when we're using things with water, it's not going to get holes as easily or tear like normal computer paper would. So this is going to hold up a little bit better with all the different supplies you could be using. Now I marked off my paper to show where I'm going to show different techniques and materials, but yours would be whatever you have drawn for this project. I also have some colored pencils here, which I'm going to use. I have my regular pencil, some crayons. I'm going to show you how we can use our washable markers and turn them into watercolor paint by using some water on top of them. And then of course I have some watercolors here. But like I said, these are just examples and some samples on things we can use for our project, but you can always choose what is going to work best for you. I think I'm going to start in my crayon section, so I'm going to put some of my other supplies down for now. And we're first going to talk about using crayons to color our project and then combining those crayons with something like watercolor to do a little bit of a resist. Now that means our crayon is going to prevent our watercolor from entering certain areas, and our crayon will not let the watercolor color over it. So wherever we put crayon, it's going to resist the watercolor, prevent it from getting in that space, and leave it the original color that we make it. So I'm going to show you some different ways we can use our crayons and our watercolors together. So the first thing is, if you are drawing something and you want your object to be a different color than the background. Let's see, I'm going to draw a little circle there that's sitting on the ground. Maybe it's a ball. Instead of using something like a permanent marker or a Sharpie, if I use crayons to trace and outline my pictures before I go in with my watercolor paints, then that crayon is going to help hold our watercolor in that specific space. So if I trace my little circle there with one color, and maybe even if I go in with another color and separate that background that I made. Now my crayon lines are going to make sure my watercolor stays in all of these separate sections and they doesn't start to mix together. So this is great if you would like to use paint, but you're afraid of your colors mixing together where you don't want them to. Using crayon to outline helps separate your different sections of your project and allows you to keep your colors nice and clean where they won't blend together if that's not what you want. And when we're using our crayons to do this, or to do anything with our watercolor really, we want some nice dark lines. So I traced over it a couple of times to fill in the space as much as possible. You don't want a lot of little white lines in there. You want your color to be pretty bright and dark on your paper, so you know it's really going to hold in all of the watercolor paint. So now once I add watercolor to this section, maybe I want to paint that inside section pink. I wet my paintbrush, I wiped it off on the edge so I didn't drip all over the place. And now when I place my watercolor paint in here, and even if I have too much paint in there and it's pooling together like I just did, that crayon is keeping it inside that circle. So now if I wanted to go in with another color and place this along the bottom, again, my crayon is going to keep those colors separate. You can see how my pink in there is not coming out and mixing with that purple that I just used. And as I fill in this space, my color is being contained in this one area. And you can even see kind of around my little pencil box, it is starting to leak out there because I didn't trace the entire thing with my crayon. I only did that one line, which is helping block our watercolor from that space. And of course, as always, when I'm jumping from different colors in my watercolor paints, I am washing my paintbrush in my water so I don't mix my colors together. And now here I can make this top half a different color. So I have it my yellow And again, my colors are staying nice and separate because I have that outline with my crayon. And that crayon is kind of like a big fence or a barrier blocking those colors from mixing together. Now, this is another great thing you can do for little details. So maybe you have a big pattern or design somewhere on your picture. If you go in and you color in all of your smaller details with your crayon, not only does it make it easier to color in those details because maybe your paintbrush is too big to get in some small spaces like this, you can also paint the background of that section way easier because having these thick layers of crayon making up your details like this will prevent our watercolor from going over it. So I can actually paint right over the top of this design. Maybe I'll use my green, and I can paint right over those circles, and you can see my crayon is resisting that watercolor. It is getting pushed right off of those circles. Even as I'm painting over it, you can see it kind of separating there and going back to where it originally was. So you can use this technique too if you have a big area you want to fill in that also has some small details. So by coloring those smaller details in with your crayon, it will make it much easier to then color in the background once you're finished. And the last thing I want to talk about with using our crayons and our watercolors together is that you can create some texture using your crayons and your watercolors. So maybe you want to create some type of leaf. And on your leaf, you want to show some lighter areas and then some darker areas. So I can start to shade it in with my crayon. I can use some darker and some lighter versions of green. I can even outline the entire thing to keep my watercolors in there. And by using little short, kind of sketchy lines almost, and then being able to paint over that with my watercolor paints, I will create a interesting texture where I'll still be able to see these harsher crayon lines while my watercolor is still shining through. So I did leave some white space in there. I do have some rough lines making up my color with my crayon. And then I can just paint right over the top of this again. And now my paint is going to fill in all of that white space that was left inside my leaf, resisting the areas where I have the crayon. So you can still see those nice texture marks to create kind of like a different feeling to our paper than just normal smooth paint and color. And then since I did outline that, again, I can go back in and fill in the background super easily without worrying that my blue that I'm using in the background is going to mix with the green that I put inside my leaf. Now, if you don't have watercolor paints at home, a great alternative that you can use is a washable marker. Now, washable markers are water-based, so that means when you add water, they start to mix and blend together. So if I were to take a colored marker like my red marker and trace over this box, I can turn this marker color that I have here into some paint. Now, I like to trace it a few times, so I have a lot of marker on my paper. That's going to help me have more paint showing up once I add water to it, because our water is kind of like thinning out the marker. So if you have a little bit more on there for it to spread out, then you're going to get more color on your paper. So I have this red box, and now I can just take my paintbrush with a little bit of water on it, and I can spread that water right on top of my marker, and I'm going to get a great effect where it's kind of darker along the edges where I made that outline, and lighter towards the center where it's turning into paint. And you can keep adding more water and kind of blending it out until you get the desired look that you would like. Now, since we're using our watercolor paper, it's really easy to lift that marker color right off and spread it out to turn it into paint. So that is another option in case you don't have watercolors at home. You can always use any kind of washable marker to get the same effect of watercolor paint. All right, while that is drying, we're going to take a trip over to our colored pencil section. And our colored pencils are another great tool that we can use to add color They're very easy to use, and when we're coloring with our colored pencils, it's great because you can sharpen them to get those really fine details that you might not be able to get with something like a crayon or a marker. Now, when we're using our colored pencils, there are different techniques that we can use to add color. So one of my favorite techniques for using colored pencils is called cross-hatching. So this is when we color back and forth in one direction. So I'm coloring across this box, going up and down with my colored pencil. And now if I want to cross-hatch, I would then turn my paper and color back again in the opposite direction. And now you can see in the areas where I am coloring, now instead of going in that up and down motion, I'm going left to right or horizontally. It is getting a lot darker, it is filling in that space a lot better, and it's going to give you a nice and neat looking full color. It will help you avoid all of those little scribble lines that you might get, and it will kind of give you like your neatest product when you're coloring. So that is a great way to use colored pencils, especially in larger areas. It's quick to be able to go back and forth in one direction and then over the top again in the opposite direction to crosshatch like that. Now, when we are using our colored pencils, you can create different values by how hard you press with your colored pencil. So you can create a little value scale to test out how you want your picture to look by coloring with your colored pencil very lightly on your paper and then gradually pushing harder to see how your color will look and how you can make it darker on your paper. So I started off by pressing super duper light to get a lighter tone of my color and pushing down harder on my paper to get a really nice dark color. Now again, you could crosshatch right over the top of the area you want darkest, and that is going to help you get even more of that original color on your paper to keep it nice and dark. And that is a great way to show shadows by keeping areas that there should be a shadow or a darker version of your color super dark by pressing down firmly on your paper, or by creating highlights, areas where you want your picture to look a lot lighter, like the sun is hitting it or like some light is hitting it, by just pressing really, really gently on your paper to create that value. And now you can always mix your colors too if you would like to get a darker or a different looking color. So if I wanted an even darker version of this color that I'm using, I could lay down a nice solid base of my color to start, and maybe I want to mix it with my darker blue. I can go ahead and again use that same cross-hatching technique here. Now I'm coloring in the opposite direction right over the top to transform that original color into something new. And now if I really want to mix those two together, I can go back in right over the top with my original color, and now I'm going to get an exciting, darker, different shade of my bluish green here than I originally started with. And you can always continue to layer those colors on top of each other until you get the color that you would like. And you can do this with any of your colored pencils, mixing those colors to get the exact shades and tones that you are interested in. You can even add lighter colors in there and see what that will do. I think adding a light color on top is a great way to help blend together the two that you might have already used to kind of finish off that color you're trying to make. And now the last thing we're going to talk about are just some basic watercolor techniques. So when you're using watercolor paints, you can do it in a couple different ways. So there are two main techniques that people use when they're using watercolor paints. And now the first one we're going to talk about is wet on wet painting. So that is when you are using your wet watercolors on wet paper. So the first thing you'd want to do is wet your paintbrush with just water and then paint that plain water right over the area that you're going to paint on. Now you can go in, wet your paintbrush, and wet your watercolor paints. And now we are wet on wet painting because my watercolor paint is wet and my paper is wet. So now when I add my watercolor paints onto my paper, you're going to see how those colors interact. They're going to spread out in the water that I put there. So if you want an interesting looking design, if you want it to be more free flowing and kind of blend together a little bit more, wet on wet painting is a great way to do that. This is also going to give you a lighter version of your color because it's going to have more water in it than if you just went straight on dry paper. I think wet on wet painting is great if you want to mix some colors together. You can see in those little dots that I added how much those colors spread out into the water that was already there. And if you add more colors in there, you can watch them all blend and mix together really nicely. I think this is great to create things like skies, sunsets, oceans, anything like that where you want your waters to kind of blend and flow together freely is a great way to do it. Now another technique is called wet on dry. So that is when we are using our wet watercolor paints on our dry paper. So I'm going to leave my paper dry and I'm going to go straight in with my watercolor paints. Now you can see right when I start, I did those two little dots like I did on my wet on wet section. They're not spreading out nearly as much. They're not creating that same flowing effect. I have a lot more control. I can paint distinct lines and shapes when I'm doing wet on dry painting because my watercolor paint isn't going to spread out nearly as much as it is if I'm painting right over the top of a wet section. So wet on dry is great if you want to do areas with details, if you want more control in what you're painting. That is a great technique to use. Now when we're using our watercolor paints, we can also build layers of color by adding different colors on top of each other to create new versions of all of our colors. So I can swirl into one color. I'm going to do some wet on dry here. So my paint is wet, but my paper is dry. And I'm going to let that pink that I have on my paper dry a little bit, and then I'm going to come back to it. So I'm going to jump down to our value scale before I build the rest of those layers. And just like we did with our colored pencil, we can create a value scale to show what we would make for highlights and for our shadows. So we can show our lightest version and our darkest version of those colors to help us when we're shading our picture in. So if I wanted to do this with my watercolor paints, I can create the darkest version of my watercolors and then the lightest version. Now when we want to lighten our watercolors, all you have to do is add more water to your paint, and that's going to give you a much lighter version. The more water you add, the less color you're going to get showing on your paper. So here I don't have that much water. I have mostly the color from that paint on there, and then as I add more water to it, it is going to blend out into almost nothing, almost like that original plain watercolor that we have there. So depending on the amount of water you use is going to help you create things like shadows and highlights and add more depth to your picture. And now as my layers box is drying, you can even see the way that these two different techniques dried is different. So I have some crisp lines in my wet on dry, I have some solid shapes, and then in my wet on wet, there is really no lines or anything separating those colors. They're all blending together more seamlessly than the way that my colors paid off with my wet on dry technique. So now, of course, you can always mix your colors together like I did in the wet on wet section, where I just let those colors blend together as they were still wet, but you can also build layers of your colors by mixing them with different colors or just using the same color over the top of itself to create a darker version of it. So in this area where I already had that dark pink dry, I can add more pink on top and get an even richer, darker version of that color. Now I can also blend other colors on top of it. If I wanted to go in with like a blue here, I can do a layer of blue on top right over my pink, and you will still be able to see that pink's defining line there where I stopped using it, but you're also going to start to get different colors in the in-between. So I can see where my blue exists, I can see where my pink exists, and I can see the purple that is made when I overlapped those two colors and created layers of color there to create purple. So you can really go about mixing colors in different ways. You can do it by letting them dry and painting layers over the top, or you can do it by letting them blend and mix together on your paper all wet. And again, you can create those different values by using water to lighten your colors like I did over here, or you can again let that paint dry and paint right over the top of it to get darker versions of itself. So we just got to look at all different ways we can add color to our pictures. So you guys can try some of these out at home. See which ones you think are going to work best for your picture. I know everyone has a different drawing this week, so what you're making might be better suited for using only colored pencil or only crayon. Maybe it would be something that you want your colors to mix and blend together, so you want to use wet on wet watercolor technique. Maybe you want to mix all of our different materials together to create your picture. It's totally up to you what you think is going to work best. You know your artwork the best and what you think is going to work well with it, so you can go ahead and try that and see how it turns out. I hope this is helpful and gave you some ideas on different ways you can add color to your picture. I can't wait to see your finished products. Try your best, have fun, and get creative, and I'll see you soon. Bye!